Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Mark Davis had been living in a whirlwind of stress. The rain poured down over the city as he walked along the slick streets of Texas, his worn backpack hanging from his shoulder. He had just come from another grueling day at law school, one of his final semesters. But nothing about his life was easy. At 23, he was drowning in the debts left by his late father. The weight of his responsibilities was crushing him, especially with his mother's medical bills looming over him, and the looming pressure to provide for his younger sister's education. But tonight, all of that was on his mind as he received an unexpected phone call. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he answered it, not knowing that this call would change everything. "Mr. Davis," a voice on the other end said, cool and confident. "This is Eleanor Brooks. I would like to meet with you. It's regarding your financial situation." Mark frowned, unsure of what was going on. "Who are you? How do you know about me?" he asked. But the woman's voice was unwavering. "I know enough. Let's meet at Brooks Bistro at 7 p.m. It's important." The call ended before Mark could ask any more questions. Confused but intrigued, Mark made his way to the bistro. The rain had gotten heavier by the time he arrived, his jacket offering little protection from the downpour. Inside the bistro, the warm light and aroma of fresh coffee provided a stark contrast to the cold outside. He approached the corner table where a striking woman with silver hair was already sitting. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that screamed wealth and power. "Mr. Davis," she said, gesturing for him to sit. Her voice was calm but authoritative. "Please, sit. I believe we have business to discuss." Mark sat down across from her, his heart pounding. He had no idea what this meeting was about, but something in the woman's eyes told him this was not going to be a typical conversation. "What is this about?" he asked, still trying to make sense of the situation. Eleanor didn't waste time. "I know about the debts you're facing, and I know how hard you've been working. I also know you are on the verge of losing everything," she said, her voice steady and calculated. Mark's mind raced, wondering who could possibly know so much about him. "What do you want from me?" he asked, unable to hide the growing frustration in his tone. Eleanor smiled faintly. "I'm here with an offer, Mr. Davis. An offer that can change everything for you. I need you to marry me." Mark blinked in disbelief, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Marry you?" Eleanor's eyes never left his. "Yes. I need a husband. A companion, someone to stand by my side in name only. In return, I will pay off all your debts, ensure your financial security, and provide you with the stability you need to care for your family." Mark's jaw tightened. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. A marriage of convenience, a contract, a business deal, nothing more. "You're serious?" Mark asked, the disbelief still evident in his voice. "Why me? Why would you want to marry someone like me?" Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "You are young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this. I don't need love, Mr. Davis. I need a companion who can stand with me publicly. You will be a part of my life, in name only. Think of it as a business arrangement." Mark felt his head spinning. This was insane. But, as much as he hated the idea, he could see no other option. His family was on the brink of losing everything. And this was the only chance he had left. His heart ached, torn between his pride and the crushing weight of his circumstances. He could walk away, but his family's future was at stake. "Let me think about it," Mark said, standing up abruptly. Eleanor nodded, her expression cool. Take your time. But don't take too long. This offer won't be on the table forever. Mark turned and walked out of the bistro, the rain still pouring down outside. The weight of the world seemed to follow him as he made his way back to his apartment, but one thought lingered in his mind: might have just made the most important decision of his life. Let's return to Mark as he tries to make sense of everything. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Mark walked home in the rain, his mind racing with what Eleanor had said. The bistro's warm lights faded behind him, replaced by the harsh sound of raindrops hitting the pavement. His jacket was soaked through, and his footsteps echoed in the empty streets. Every step felt heavier than the last as the weight of the decision began to settle in his chest. He knew he had no other option. His family was struggling, and if he didn't accept this offer, they would lose everything. The thought of marrying someone he barely knew, for nothing but money, gnawed at him. But Eleanor's words kept ringing in his ears: I will pay off all your debts. You'll be financially secure. This is the only way. The decision was simple, yet impossible to accept. He had always prided himself on his independence, but now he was faced with the reality of his situation. His mother's medical bills, his sister's tuition fees, and the constant pressure of keeping the family afloat was all too much. He needed this offer, no matter how much it cost him personally. Later that evening, Mark stood outside the Brooks estate. The grand mansion loomed in front of him, its dark silhouette glowing faintly under the moonlight. He had driven through the massive gates, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. He had made the decision, and now there was no turning back. The driver opened the door for him, and he stepped out into the cold night air. The mansion was silent, except for the sound of his footsteps as he walked toward the front door. It felt like a dream, something out of a movie. He was about to marry a woman he didn't love, for reasons he couldn't even begin to understand. But he had no choice. The door opened before he could ring the bell, and Eleanor stood there, waiting for him. She was exactly as he remembered: poised, elegant, and unfazed by the storm that was raging outside. Mr. Davis, she said, her voice cool but welcoming, please, come in. He followed her into the grand foyer, where the warmth of the house enveloped him like a blanket. The interior of the house was just as grand as the exterior. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, and the walls were adorned with rich, expensive artwork. It felt like a different world, one he had never imagined stepping into. Eleanor led him through the hallways to a sitting room, where they sat down across from each other. You've made the right decision, Mark, Eleanor said, her eyes never leaving his. This will be a good arrangement for both of us. You'll have everything you need, and I will have the companionship I require. Mark nodded, though doubt still lingered in the pit of his stomach. The whole situation felt surreal. But he had no choice. Eleanor reached for a folder on the table and slid it over to him. Here are the terms of our agreement. Please review them carefully. Once you sign, everything will be taken care of. Mark glanced at the contract, his eyes scanning the pages filled with legal jargon. It was a business deal, nothing more. He could already feel the weight of it settling over him. There was no room for emotions here. He wasn't marrying for love, was marrying for survival. I'll sign, Mark said, his voice steady but with an underlying uncertainty. Eleanor gave him a small smile, the corners of her lips curling up just slightly. Good, she replied. Once the papers are signed, you will officially be my husband. She handed him a pen, and he signed the contract without a second thought. It wasn't the marriage he had imagined, but it was the only way out. Eleanor seemed satisfied, but there was something in her eyes, a glimmer of something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. It was as if she, too, was hiding something beneath the surface, but he didn't have the time or the energy to think about it. They stood up, and Eleanor led him to the grand staircase. "We'll announce our engagement tomorrow," she said, her voice calm and professional. "Everything will be in place. Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis." Mark followed her up the stairs, his mind still reeling from the decision he had just made. He had traded his freedom for security, his pride for the survival of his family. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain: his life was never going to be the same again. As they reached the top of the stairs, Eleanor turned to him with a small but confident smile. "You'll be staying here for now," she said. "We'll begin preparing for the announcement. Everything will fall into place." Mark nodded, though he still wasn't sure what was happening. All he knew was that he was now bound to Eleanor by a contract, a piece of paper that would change the course of his life forever. Let's return to Mark as he adjusts to his new life. The next morning, Mark woke up in the grand master suite of Eleanor's mansion. The room was lavish, with its four-poster bed, velvet curtains, and antique furniture. He had never imagined living in such a place. The sun streamed through the windows, casting soft rays over the polished hardwood floors. For a moment, it felt like a dream until the reality of his situation hit him again. He was married now, not out of love, but out of necessity. He had signed a contract with a woman he barely knew, and his future was now tied to hers. Mark sat up in bed, his mind racing. The weight of what he had done still pressed on him. He had agreed to this arrangement for his family's sake, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. As he walked through the hallway, the sound of his footsteps echoing on the marble floors, Mark felt a strange sense of disconnect. He was no longer just a struggling law student, he was now part of a world he had never imagined: wealth, power, and a life built on a contract. He was heading to the dining room, where Eleanor had arranged for them to have breakfast together. When he arrived, she was already sitting at the table, looking as composed and confident as always. Her presence was commanding, and her beauty seemed effortless, as if she had been born into this life of privilege and power. "Good morning, Mr. Davis," Eleanor greeted him with a smile, her voice smooth and collected. "I trust you slept well?" Mark nodded, still feeling somewhat disoriented. "Yes, thank you." He sat down across from her, noticing the perfectly set table: fresh fruit, warm croissants, and a pot of coffee waiting to be poured. It felt surreal. Everything about this world was different from his own. He had never experienced such luxury before, and yet, it seemed empty. His mind kept drifting back to the reality of his situation: he was married to a woman he didn't know, for reasons that had nothing to do with love. Eleanor poured him a cup of coffee, her movements precise and graceful. "I hope you are adjusting to your new life," she said, looking at him intently. Mark took a sip of the coffee, savoring the warmth. "I'm getting there," he replied. "It's just a lot to take in." Eleanor smiled, a glimmer of something unreadable in her eyes. "I understand. This is a big change, but I assure you, you'll find your place here. You're going to be an important part of my world, Mr. Davis." Her words were calculated, but there was something in her tone that made him pause. It wasn't just business to her. It was more than that, but he wasn't sure what. As the morning went on, they discussed the upcoming public announcement of their engagement. Eleanor had arranged for a press release to be sent out later that day, and they would be attending a gala in the evening to make their relationship public. Mark's role was simply stand by her side, smile, and play his part. But as he sat there, listening to her plans, a part of him began to feel uneasy. He was about to step into a world that was completely foreign to him, and he wasn't sure if he was ready. He had never liked the idea of being in the spotlight, especially not under such circumstances. After breakfast, Eleanor took him on a tour of the mansion, showing him the lavish rooms and explaining the details of their upcoming events. As they walked through the halls, Mark couldn't help but feel like a stranger in his own life. Everything seemed so extravagant, so meticulously designed, but it lacked warmth. There were no personal touches, no signs of life outside of business. He wondered if this was how Eleanor had lived her entire life: alone, surrounded by wealth and power but with no real connection to anyone. The thought made him feel even more like an outsider. Later that day, as the press release went out and the preparations for the gala began, Mark found himself standing in front of a full-length mirror, adjusting his tuxedo. He looked different, like someone else entirely. The man staring back at him wasn't the Mark Davis he had known just a few days ago. He was no longer just a law student struggling to make ends meet. He was a married man, bound to a woman he barely understood, thrust into a world that demanded perfection. His reflection seemed distant, a stranger to him. At the gala that evening, Mark stood beside Eleanor, his clear smile, look presentable, and be her companion for the night. The media was all around them, snapping photos and asking questions. Eleanor handled it all with grace, answering questions about their engagement with ease. But Mark felt like an imposter. He had no idea what he was doing here, and he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Eleanor's hand rested gently on his arm, but even that felt distant. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this arrangement than she was letting on. As the night went on, Mark couldn't help but notice the way people looked at him. The wealth, the luxury, it was all so new to him. But it didn't feel real. It felt like a performance, a show he was forced to participate in. He caught a glimpse of himself in a nearby mirror, his tuxedo sharp, his posture perfect, but his eyes, they looked lost. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the act. But for now, all he could do was play his part and pretend that everything was fine. Let's return to Mark as he continues to navigate this new life he never asked for. As the weeks passed, Mark's life began to settle into a strange new rhythm. The mansion, once so foreign to him, now felt like his new reality. He spent his days attending meetings with Eleanor, handling her business affairs, and preparing for the public events she organized. But despite the luxury and the promises of financial security, something inside him still felt empty. Eleanor had become a constant presence in his life, and yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still just a pawn in her game. She was everything he wasn't: confident, controlled, and seemingly without vulnerability. But Mark was beginning to wonder if there was more to her than the cold businesswoman he had first met. One evening, as Mark sat in the drawing room of the mansion, he found himself staring out the large windows, watching the sunset over the expansive grounds. The sky was painted with shades of pink and gold, but inside, he still felt a heaviness he couldn't explain. Eleanor had invited him to join her for dinner, but tonight, she was unusually quiet, something in her demeanor shifting as she entered the room. She looked at him, her eyes piercing, but there was something different in them this time, something he couldn't quite read. "You've been distant lately," Eleanor said, her voice low but pointed. Mark turned to face her, his hands resting on the armrests of the chair. "I've just been adjusting," he replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. He didn't want to get into another conversation about how strange this whole arrangement was. He had already told her he was adjusting, but it seemed that answer was no longer enough. Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes studying him. "You don't have to pretend with me, Mark. I know you're not comfortable in this world. But I assure you, you will get used to it. You just need to trust me." Mark met her gaze, feeling a flash of irritation. Trust her? He wasn't sure he could trust anyone anymore. He had trusted her once, when he signed the contract, but now he was beginning to feel like he was trapped in a world where trust had no place. "I don't know if I can," he admitted quietly. "I never thought I'd be living like this. I didn't expect any of this to happen." Eleanor seemed to soften for a moment, her expression shifting as if she understood. But then, just as quickly, her composure returned. "I didn't expect it either," she said. "But we both know why we're here, Mark. You're here because you needed a way out. And I'm here because I needed someone to stand beside me. It's not about love. It's about partnership. We both knew the terms when we agreed to this." Mark looked away, feeling the weight of her words. She was right in a way. They had both entered this arrangement for practical reasons, not for love. But that didn't make it any easier to accept. He still found it hard to reconcile the man he was before this marriage with the man he was now. He had gone from struggling student to a man living in a mansion, attending galas, and standing beside a woman he barely knew, all in the name of survival. It didn't feel real. Later that evening, as they sat at dinner, the conversation seemed to flow more easily. The tension that had hung between them earlier seemed to dissipate, replaced by a quieter understanding. Eleanor spoke about her plans for the future, her businesses, and the charity work she was involved in. She was passionate about it all, and for a moment, Mark saw a different side of her, the side of Eleanor that wasn't just focused on the business side of things. It was the first time he saw her as more than just a CEO, and in that moment, he realized something: they weren't so different after all. She was just as trapped in her world as he was in his. They were both trying to find their way, navigating a life they hadn't chosen. The conversation shifted, and Eleanor asked him about his past, about his dreams before all of this started. Mark hesitated at first, unsure if he wanted to share such personal things with her. But for some reason, he found himself telling her about his dreams of becoming a successful lawyer, of making enough money to support his family without relying on anyone else. He told her about his father's passing, and how it had left him with so much responsibility at such a young age. Eleanor listened intently, her expression softening as he spoke. It was the first time she had truly listened to him without any judgment, and for the first time, Mark felt like he could breathe. There was no pressure, no expectation. Just two people sitting at a table, sharing their stories. After dinner, as they stood by the fireplace, Mark looked at Eleanor, feeling a shift between them. It wasn't love, but it was something else: a mutual understanding, a respect for each other's struggles. It wasn't the perfect marriage he had imagined, but maybe it didn't have to be. Maybe this partnership could work, even if it wasn't built on love. Mark felt a quiet sense of peace for the first time since the contract had been signed. Maybe this was the start of something new. Not a love story, but a story of healing and mutual support. And for now, that was enough. Let's return to Mark as he begins to navigate this new chapter of his life. The days that followed brought a strange sense of calm. Mark had stopped questioning his new life, or at least he tried to. He still woke up each morning in the grand mansion, still had his breakfast with Eleanor, and still accompanied her to meetings and events. But something was changing inside him. The initial emptiness he had felt when he signed the contract was slowly being replaced with a sense of responsibility, a strange but undeniable connection to the life he was now living. Eleanor, for all her coldness and businesslike demeanor, seemed to be opening up more as well. They spent more time talking, not just about their roles in the public eye but also about their pasts, their fears, and their dreams. For the first time, Mark found himself questioning if this was truly a marriage of convenience or something more. One afternoon, as they sat in the study together, reviewing financial reports for Eleanor's various companies, Mark found himself looking at her in a new light. Eleanor was, without a doubt, a brilliant businesswoman, but there was something vulnerable beneath her polished exterior. She had built an empire, but there were cracks in her armor, moments when the facade of the perfect CEO slipped, and Mark saw her for who she really was: someone who had been alone for much of her life, someone who had built walls to protect herself from the world. It was these moments that made him begin to see Eleanor differently. She wasn't just a powerful, cold businesswoman. She was a woman with her own fears, her own scars, and her own longing for connection. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Eleanor invited Mark to join her in the library. She had been quiet all day, and Mark could sense that something was bothering her. They sat across from each other, the crackling of the fireplace the only sound between them. "Mark," Eleanor said softly, breaking the silence. "Do you ever feel like we're living a lie?" Mark blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" he asked, unsure of where this conversation was going. Eleanor hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the fire before meeting his eyes. "I know we've both been pretending that this is just a business arrangement, that we're fine with it. But sometimes, I wonder if we're fooling ourselves." Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if she was afraid of the words that might come next. Mark felt a pang in his chest. He knew exactly what she meant. He had been pretending too, pretending that this was just a contract, that his feelings didn't matter. But as the days went by, it was becoming harder to maintain that illusion. He had started to care for her in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something deeper than he had ever anticipated. "I think we both knew what we were getting into when we made this arrangement," Mark said, his voice steady. "But that doesn't mean we have to keep pretending forever. Maybe we can figure out what this really is." Eleanor didn't reply at first, and for a moment, the silence stretched between them. Mark could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was calculating, analyzing, trying to make sense of the emotions that were clearly unsettling her. "I never expected it to be like this," she finally said, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "I thought I could keep everything compartmentalized, business here, emotions there. But now, I don't know anymore." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the unspoken truth they both had been avoiding. Mark leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "It's okay to feel something, Eleanor," he said gently. "We don't have to have everything figured out right now. We can take it one step at a time." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes softening. For the first time in a long while, Mark saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, a hope that maybe, just maybe, this arrangement could be something more than either of them had expected. The next day, their relationship began to shift in small but significant ways. Eleanor was no longer just the businesswoman who had hired him for a contract marriage. She was someone he could talk to, someone he could trust with his thoughts and feelings. And he, in turn, was beginning to open up to her more, sharing things about his past that he had never told anyone. It wasn't love, but it was a a bond that was slowly but surely growing stronger. As the weeks went on, they began to share more moments of vulnerability, moments when the walls they had built around themselves began to crack. Eleanor would tell Mark about her childhood, the loneliness she had felt growing up in a family that valued success over everything else. Mark would share his struggles with his father's death and how it had shaped his view of the world. It was these small moments of honesty that brought them closer, that turned their fake marriage into something that felt, in some ways, real. But despite the progress they had made, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many emotions they hadn't fully explored. Would they ever fall in love? Could a marriage built on a contract really turn into something meaningful? Only time would tell. Let's return to Mark and Eleanor as they continue to navigate the complicated path they've chosen. Days turned into weeks, and the tension that had once clouded Mark and Eleanor's relationship began to dissolve. They were no longer just two people bound by a contract. Something had shifted between them, subtle at first, but undeniable as time went on. They spent more time together outside of business meetings, and for the first time, they found themselves enjoying each other's company. Eleanor had even started to make small, personal gestures, asking about Mark's day, cooking dinner together occasionally, and sharing things about her childhood that revealed a side of her he had never seen before. Mark, in turn, began to open up more as well, telling Eleanor about his ambitions, his dreams, and his struggles with his father's death. It was a slow process, but their connection deepened, one conversation at a time. One evening, as they sat in the cozy dining room, Mark noticed how different things felt. The house, once intimidating and cold, now felt more like home. Eleanor sat across from him, her eyes soft as she listened to him speak. The atmosphere was light, comfortable even. It was the first time in a long while that Mark felt like he could truly relax in her presence. "You know, I never thought I'd be able to have a normal dinner again," Mark said, leaning back in his chair with a smile. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Before all of this, I was so consumed by everything: law school, the debts, trying to keep my family afloat. I never took the time to enjoy simple things like this." He gestured to the table, where 2 glasses of wine sat between them. "This is nice," he added, his voice quieter now, "and I'm not sure I ever realized how much I needed it until now." Eleanor's expression softened, and for the first time, Mark saw a glimmer of something different in her eyes, something beyond the confident, business-savvy exterior she always projected. "I never thought I'd get to do things like this either," Eleanor admitted. "I've spent so much of my life building a reputation, managing everything, that I forgot what it was like to just live. To enjoy the company of someone who wasn't just there for business." There was a vulnerability in her voice that Mark hadn't expected, and it made him realize that beneath her cool, collected demeanor, Eleanor was just as human as he was. She was someone who had been alone for a long time, just like him, and maybe just maybe this arrangement they had wasn't as one-sided as he had once thought. As the night went on, they found themselves laughing more than usual, exchanging stories about their pasts, about their failures, and about the moments that had shaped them. Eleanor laughed at a silly story Mark told about a failed internship during his first year of college, and Mark found himself smiling at her more than he had in weeks. It was an unexpected but pleasant shift in their dynamic. It wasn't just a marriage of convenience anymore. It was a partnership, one that was growing stronger with each passing day. Later that week, Mark received a call from his mother. She was having another round of tests done, and she asked if he could be there to help her through the process. The worry in her voice made his heart ache. He hadn't been able to visit her as often as he wanted to, what with the demands of his new life and the constant pressure of maintaining the image of a perfect marriage. Eleanor had noticed his distraction and, sensing his unease, asked him what was wrong. "It's my mom," Mark said, looking down at his phone. "She's having some tests done, and I promised I'd be there. But with everything going on here, I don't know if I can leave for a few days." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing her options. "Go," she said, surprising him. "Take the time you need. I'll handle everything here." Mark blinked in surprise. "You're sure?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, her voice steady. "I'm sure. Family comes first. You've been here for me, and I'll be here for you too." Mark felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. He had always believed that he was on his own, that no one would truly understand what he was going through, but Eleanor, the woman he had married out of necessity, had shown him something different, something more than he had ever expected. For the first time, Mark allowed himself to breathe a little easier. He could go visit his mother without feeling like he was abandoning his responsibilities, without the constant weight of his new life hanging over him. When Mark returned to the mansion a few days later, Eleanor was waiting for him. She had arranged a quiet dinner for them, and there was something about the way she looked at him that made him realize how far they had come. They were no longer just pretending. They were no longer just fulfilling a contract. They were becoming a team. And that was something Mark hadn't anticipated when he first agreed to this arrangement. As the evening went on, Mark found himself smiling more easily, his heart lighter than it had been in months. Eleanor reached across the table, touching his hand for just a moment, her gaze soft. "You know, Mark," she said, her voice gentle, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad we did this. I'm glad we have this." Mark looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Me too," he replied. "Me too." Let's return to Mark as he continues to navigate the complexities of his new life, one step at a time. As the weeks went by, the bond between Mark and Eleanor continued to grow. Their initial arrangement, built on necessity and convenience, had slowly evolved into something deeper, something neither of them had expected. It wasn't love, at least not yet, but it was a genuine connection. They spent more time together, not just in the boardrooms or at social events, but in the quiet moments that made their partnership feel more real. They took walks in the garden, shared dinners by the fire, and had conversations about everything from politics to personal ambitions. Slowly, Mark started to realize that Eleanor wasn't just the powerful CEO he had once seen her as. She was a woman with her own dreams, her own vulnerabilities, and she was letting him see them. And for the first time in a long while, Mark found himself feeling truly understood. One evening, as they were sitting in the library after dinner, Eleanor turned to him with a thoughtful look in her eyes. "Mark," she began, her voice softer than usual, "I've been thinking about something. I've been wondering what happens after all of this. After the contract is up, after everything we've promised each other." Mark looked at her, unsure of where the conversation was going. "What do you mean?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "I mean, when this is over, what do we do then? I've been so focused on making this work, on fulfilling the terms of the agreement, that I haven't really stopped to think about what's next for us." Mark felt a strange mix of emotions stir inside him. He hadn't really thought about what would happen when the contract ended. They had both been so consumed by the day-to-day of their arrangement, by the performances they put on for the public and the media, that they hadn't truly addressed the bigger picture. He had assumed that, once their obligations were fulfilled, they would simply go their separate ways, as planned. But now, hearing Eleanor's words, he realized that it wasn't so simple. This partnership had changed them both. "I don't know," Mark admitted quietly. "I never really thought about what happens when it's all over. But I do know that whatever happens, I don't want to go back to how things were before." There was a brief silence between them, as Eleanor seemed to process his words. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to read his thoughts. Finally, she spoke again, her voice steady. "I don't want that either," she said. "I don't want to go back to being alone. To living a life of control and distance, pretending like everything's perfect when it's not. I've been doing that for so long, I don't know if I can anymore." Mark was surprised by her honesty. For the first time, Eleanor wasn't just the composed woman he had come to know. She was showing a side of herself that was raw, vulnerable, and real. As the conversation continued, Mark realized how much had changed in the time they had spent together. He had come into this arrangement thinking that he would simply be helping Eleanor, playing his part in a marriage of convenience. But now, he could see how much they had both invested in each other. This partnership, this arrangement, had turned into something that neither of them had anticipated. Eleanor had begun to trust him, to rely on him, and for the first time, Mark felt like he wasn't just someone she needed for business purpose. She was becoming someone she cared about. Later that night, as Mark lay in bed, he couldn't help but replay the conversation in his mind. He had been afraid to admit it, even to himself, but he realized he cared for Eleanor in a way that went beyond the contract they had signed. He wasn't sure what that meant, or what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: didn't want to lose this connection they had. The thought of going back to his old life, to the way things had been before this all started, felt impossible. He had changed, and so had she. This was no longer just a business arrangement. It was something real, something worth fighting for. The next day, as they attended yet another high-profile event, Mark found himself standing beside Eleanor, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't felt before. They were a team now, not just in the eyes of the public, but in their own lives. And as he looked at her, her face illuminated by the flashing cameras and the bright lights of the event, he realized that whatever came next, he wanted to face it with her by his side. Let's return to Mark and Eleanor as they continue to navigate the complexities of their growing bond and face the challenges ahead. The days after the gala felt different for Mark and Eleanor. The bond they had developed over the past few months was undeniable, and it was becoming clearer that their arrangement was no longer just a contract. It had transformed into something that neither of them could easily define. Mark had always expected this marriage to be temporary, a business deal that would end once their mutual goals had been met. But now, with each passing day, he found himself caring for Eleanor in ways he hadn't anticipated. He began to see her not just as a powerful CEO but as a woman with her own struggles, her own vulnerabilities. And that realization made him question everything about their future. One evening, as they sat in the quiet of the study, Eleanor turned to Mark with a serious expression on her face. "Mark," she began, her voice softer than usual, "there's something I've been thinking about. Something I think we need to address." Mark put down the book he had been reading, sensing that this conversation was important. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his voice steady but curious. Eleanor hesitated, taking a deep breath before she spoke again. "We've come a long way since we signed that contract. But now I'm wondering, what happens when it's over? I don't want to be the kind of person who just walks away from something real when it feels like we've built something that matters." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected her to say that, and for a moment, he wasn't sure how to respond. The idea that their arrangement might end soon had never crossed his mind, but hearing Eleanor voice her doubts made him realize that he, too, had started to imagine a future that involved more than just the contract they had signed. "I never thought about it like that," Mark admitted, looking at her. I've always been focused on what we needed to pay off the debts, manage the public image. But now, I'm starting to see that we've built something here, something real. Eleanor nodded, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Exactly. And I'm not sure if I'm ready to walk away from that. I don't want this to just be a phase in my life. I want it to be something lasting. But I need to know, Mark, do you feel the same way? The question hung in the air, thick with unspoken emotions. Mark took a moment to process her words. He had been so focused on his obligations, on fulfilling the role of a husband for appearance's sake, that he hadn't allowed himself to truly consider what their relationship meant. But now, hearing her vulnerable words, he realized that his feelings had changed in ways he hadn't expected. He looked at her, his heart pounding. I do feel the same way, he said, his voice steady. I didn't want to admit it at first, but this what we have, it's not just a contract anymore. It's something that feels real. I can't pretend like it's just business. I've come to care about you more than I ever thought possible. Eleanor's eyes softened as she listened to him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was comfortable, as if they had both acknowledged something important that had been left unsaid. After a few moments, Eleanor broke the silence. Then what do we do about it? What happens next? Mark thought for a moment, realizing that he had no clear answer. But for the first time, he wasn't scared of the unknown. The uncertainty of their future didn't seem so daunting anymore. I think we take it one step at a time, he said. We've already built something together, and we don't need to have all the answers right now. But we can figure it out, together. Eleanor smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. Together, she repeated, her voice soft but resolute. I like the sound of that. It was a simple word, but in that moment, it meant everything. They were no longer just two people bound by a contract. They were partners, not just in name, but in life. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, both Mark and Eleanor felt hopeful about what lay ahead. As the days passed, their connection grew even stronger. They continued to navigate the complexities of their relationship, but now with a sense of shared purpose. They weren't just fulfilling their obligations to each other, they were building a future, one step at a time. And in that, Mark realized, he had found something far more valuable than anything he had imagined when he first signed that contract. He had found love in the most unexpected place. Let's return to Mark and Eleanor as they continue to navigate this new chapter in their journey. Months passed, and Mark and Eleanor's life together became something neither of them had expected. What had started as a contract, a business arrangement, had slowly transformed into a deep and genuine connection. They were no longer just playing roles, they were partners, in every sense of the word. Their relationship had become the anchor they both needed, and through their shared experiences, they had found something more valuable than either of them had ever anticipated. The tension that once existed between them had long faded, replaced by mutual trust and respect. And for the first time, they were living a life that was no longer dictated by obligations but by choices. One quiet evening, as they sat together on the balcony, watching the sunset, Eleanor turned to Mark with a thoughtful expression on her face. Mark, she said, her voice softer than usual, do you ever think about the future? About what comes next for us? Mark looked at her, his heart warm with the feeling that had grown between them over the months. I do, he replied, his voice steady. And for the first time, I'm not afraid of it. Before, everything felt so uncertain, so out of control. But now, I feel like we're building something real. Together. Eleanor's smile was gentle, her eyes reflecting the warmth of the moment. You're right, she said. We've built something real. Something that goes beyond all the things we thought we needed. I never imagined that a marriage like this, one born out of necessity, could turn into something like this. But I'm glad it did. Mark reached out and took her hand in his, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. I'm glad too, he said, his voice filled with sincerity. I never imagined any of this, but now I can't imagine my life without it. Without you. For the first time, the idea of a future together didn't feel uncertain, it felt right. They weren't just going through the motions anymore. They were building a life, a real one, together. A life that wasn't based on what they had been told to expect but on what they had chosen for themselves. Their connection had blossomed into something neither of them had anticipated, and it was no longer just a contract, it was a partnership that had grown stronger with time. The next few months brought more changes and growth. Mark and Eleanor's relationship continued to evolve. They learned to balance their personal lives with their responsibilities, finding ways to support each other in ways they hadn't thought possible. There were challenges, of course, but they faced them together, side by side. And through it all, the love and respect they had for one another grew deeper. One evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city, Mark took Eleanor's hand, his heart full of gratitude for everything they had been through. "I never would have thought this is where we'd end up," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But I wouldn't change a thing. You've changed my life in ways I never could have imagined." Eleanor smiled, her eyes shining with warmth. "I feel the same way," she said, her voice full of affection. "We may have started this as a business arrangement, but we've turned it into something far greater. We've built a life together, Mark. A life that's truly ours." Mark looked at her, his heart swelling with love. "Together," he repeated, the word feeling more meaningful than ever before. "Forever." And with that, they knew that their journey was just beginning. The road ahead wasn't always clear, but they had each other, and that was enough. No longer just bound by a contract, but by a love that had grown from the most unexpected of beginnings. Together, they were ready to face whatever the future held. Let's return to Mark and Eleanor as they continue to navigate this new chapter of their lives, side by side.